Hello and welcome to this podcast from the BBC World Service. Please let us know what you think and tell other people about us on social media. Podcasts from the BBC World Service are supported by advertising.
Welcome to Hard Talk with me, Zainab Badawi, coming to you from Barbados. I'm on an historic sugar plantation where enslaved Africans toiled in back-breaking labour during 3 centuries of the transatlantic slave trade. Barbados was one of the earliest and most profitable of the slave colonies in the Caribbean. My guest is Barbados-born eminent historian Sir Hilary Beckles. He's Vice-Chancellor of the University of the West Indies and Chair of a Caribbean Commission to gain reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans. What are his chances of success? Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, welcome to Hard Talk.
Tremendous honour. Pleasure to be here.
So we're here in the part of Barbados that is your ancestral land. Your great-great-great-grandparents worked on sugar plantations just nearby. What is the legacy of that history of slavery here in Barbados?
Well, this is where the global world and a small island came together 400 years ago. This is Barbados, the first slave plantation economy in the world. This is where slavery, plantations, British capitalism all came together, a small place becoming a center of the financial world of the West. It's a tremendous history.
A tremendous history, but it's also one of great, great tragedy.
Oh, absolutely. The entire structures we see here, these economic systems called plantations, the enslavement of thousands of African peoples on these islands, the tragic nature of the slave trade, the exploitation of people at the most extreme levels in human history, all generating tremendous wealth. And Barbados became known as the wealthiest colony in the world because of slavery and sugar, and the way in which it plugged into the British economy, the way in which Britain grew wealthy out of all of this. So the legacy of British enslavement, the exploitation of African peoples on these plantations, the legacies are all around us. The poverty, the underdevelopment, the consistent institutional racism, white supremacy, all of those structures that made the system work are still here with us.
So you are chair of a Caribbean Commission, CARICOM, the inaugural chair in 2013, a commission set up to look at reparations, to redress all these grievances that you've just set out. But I'll be frank with you, talking to diplomatic sources here in Barbados, Western sources, they say reparations, this isn't a topic that concerns the ordinary Barbadian.
At every moment in history, when there's a major crime to be adjudicated, a major transition to be made, the general view has always been, it's not going to happen in my lifetime. If you ask the enslaved people in 1830, British Parliament is going to legislate the abolition of slavery in 1833. But if you took a census on the West Indian sugar plantations among the enslaved, and you asked them the question, will you ever see freedom in your lifetime? I would wager that the majority of enslaved people who had been enslaved for 200-300 years would have said, we will never see freedom.
Let's just look at the legacy of slavery. You've outlined some of the economic grievances. Let me tell you what a French African historian says, Amzat Boukari Yabara. He says young people of African descent in France today are insurrectional because their history has never been taken into account. So the question I want to ask you is this: how far do you think there's a difference between Africans or people of African descent living in black majority countries such as Barbados and those living in white majority countries such as France?
There's always a kind of volatility based on the diversity of knowledge and content. When I was growing up as a teenager in the British high school system, we were never taught anything about British colonial history, imperialism. I went through the British university system. We were never taught anything about British imperial history. And so there is a diversity of content. The majority of British people do not know anything of significance about what they did to other people in other parts of the world in order to secure their enrichment. So yes, we have this diversity of opinion, but this is why reparatory justice is much more than a conversation about the African people specifically. What you're talking about is the unraveling of modernity. the crumbling of the structures that supported modernity, the white supremacy, the racism, the colonization, the
Can you lay
imperialism,
all of that at the door?
All of that is breaking down to create a new frontier for the 21st century.
But can you lay all of that to the slave legacy, discriminatory policing practices?
That's the core of it. I mean,
Really?
what happened in India with the destruction of the Indian 19th century industrial economy by Britain? What is happening all over Africa? What happened to the indigenous people of the New World? All of this is part of the same conversation. The African part of it is a critical part of it, but it goes beyond the African experience.
So do you think that in the light of the killing of George Floyd last year and the BLM protests, that there is a new awakening? I tell you what Michelle Bachelet, the UN Human Rights Commissioner, former president of Chile, said after the killing of Floyd: behind today's racial violence, systemic racism and discriminatory policing lies the failure to acknowledge and confront the legacy of the slave trade and colonialism.
Well, absolutely.
Is she right?
Absolutely. Listen, reparatory justice has always been about the gap between what the victims know and what the rest of the world is willing to admit. And there has been this schism between self-knowledge and public knowledge. However, the George Floyd circumstance converged the two. The world saw for themselves what we had been seeing all along in our communities. But that has been taking place all over the world. We've seen it in South Africa during the anti-apartheid struggle. The world did not really care much about apartheid in South Africa until the killing of young people on the streets demonstrating. Then the observations came together.
A lot of people look at the African American diaspora and, see what happens there in the United States as an example of what might happen in other parts of the world. And in April, the House Judiciary Committee in the United States voted on a bill which would set up a federal commission to study, as they put it, the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery in the United States, looking at various economic, political, educational and social discrimination, and to develop appropriate remedies, it says, including potential reparations. Now, that bill was approved and is awaiting a vote in the House of Representatives. Do you sense that we are going to get some kind of movement on reparations in the United States? And if so, what will the impact be?
Well, let me say, it's a relay race. The Caribbean at this moment is at the center of this global discussion. What happened in the Caribbean was very significant. Civil society talking about this, demanding this, the Rastafarian community, the Pan-African community, speaking about reparations for over 100 years. What was critical in 2013 was that the governments of the Caribbean finally came on board and said, we are now supporting this civil society movement. They joined the cause. When that happened in the Caribbean, it had tremendous consequences for the U.S. And therefore the U.S. reparations movement was revitalized, re-energized, and similarly, they formed a national African American Reparations Commission modeled on the Caribbean case, calling upon their governments, as we did in the Caribbean, to come on board.
Let me tell you what Jamaica's Minister of Sport, Youth and Culture, Olivia Grange, has said. We're hoping for reparatory justice in all forms. Redress is well overdue. Better speak with one voice and have one considered position by all people of African descent. The Caribbean, the United States and Brazil. That's the problem. There's no united position on this. You don't speak with one voice.
But I don't know if we need it. Reparatory justice has always been a very broad tent.
You don't think you need to speak with one voice, all people of African descent?
We have never needed to speak with one voice. We have never had one voice.
But why?
Because there's tremendous intellectual diversity within the African American community. There's tremendous conceptual and pedagogical variations across the dynamics of the black world and the brown world. Now, to expect one voice is to actually hinder your progress.
But surely not. It's everybody of African descent, regardless of which continent they live. The Americas, where many enslaved Africans ended up, countries like Brazil, the Caribbean here, Europe, all over the world.
We all know what we want, but there are different ways to conceptualize it. There are different ways to proceed. There are multiple roads leading to the roundabout. And we don't want to necessarily to have everyone walking like sheep down a narrow path. We are a community of multiple experiences and diversities. In the US, for example, there's a very strong argument that says we want cash in hand as part of the repayment of the plunder of the African American community. We have been plundered. We can demonstrate it. We've lost our land. We've lost our businesses. We've had the personal victimization. We want to have this repaired in hard cash. In the Caribbean, we've not taken that path. We have said our reparatory justice model is about development of our infrastructures. We want more schools, we want public health infrastructures, we want to have systems to allow development to become endemic within our societies. And that is the focus of our reparation. Take for example, what happened in Tulsa. A white community goes into a black town.
You're talking about back in the 1920s in the United States.
Burnt the town to the ground. Hundreds of families lost their cash and their capital. Now,
it was a very middle-class, affluent
they were
African-American
rising up
community.
from slavery, pursuing development, lost their capital. That has to be compensated for in the context of cash repayments and compensation. In the Caribbean, we are looking at a different circumstance. We have the highest percentage of diabetes, hypertensions in the world per capita, the result of these sugar plantations where you consume what you grew. You grew sugar, you consume it. Now we all have a sugar problem in the Caribbean because we've been eating sugar as a meal and exposed to that, and now we are all addicted to it with the consequences. We have to repair that.
So you say every community has to go about the way that reparations are made in their own fashion that suits their community. Let me tell you what the black entertainment billionaire Robert Johnson in the United States says. He wants $14 trillion in reparations. He says, we as a country, the United States, must atone by paying back black people of all stripes, the rich ones, poor ones, and the middle. I mean, even people like Oprah Winfrey or LeBron James could be paid under this principle. When somebody like that makes that kind of comment, it invites mockery, doesn't it, that the likes of Oprah Winfrey should be paid?
What it invites is a call for understanding. What we do know is that we're all united around the reparatory justice movement. What we also know is that there is a diversity as to how and to where and what have we. But the beneficiaries of those crimes, the Western states and the institutions and the corporations, ought not to be in a position to determine how we perceive reparatory justice. It is for us, the descendants of the victim class, and all of us are victimized as a race. If you consider the slave trade, when the Europeans went into Africa to kidnap and to pillage the labor force of Africa, they were not looking at the income distribution of the peoples they were enslaving. There were agricultural people, there were teachers, there were artisans, there were politicians. All kinds of people were scraped up in the slave trade and brought to the sugar plantations. They didn't consider the diversity of occupation and wealth at the time, so why should they be concerned about it today? It has always been a feature of the victimization of the black community.
All right, but how do you make the case now? Look, here we are in Barbados. It's a middle-income country,
yes,
so it doesn't qualify for a lot of development aid. So when you have somebody like Rory Stewart, who in the United Kingdom was a former Secretary for International Development, and he says he would have liked to target UK aid to the poorest people in the world, rather than paying reparations in some weird belief, he says, that we're going to somehow undo 300, 400 years of colonial history by writing checks to people.
Well, there you go again. There you go again. The narrative of those who believe that they ought to determine for the victims of this process how they should
But no, he's saying, let me pay it to poorer people in the world, target UK aid there rather than to the
slave owners,
relatively affluent people in Barbados.
Zainab, in the face of emancipation legislation, the slave owners were saying to the British and European parliaments, you don't need to pass emancipation legislation. So many of the enslaved people are doing well. So many of them now have their own home, they have property, and then a percentage of them are free, and they're doing so well. All you have to do is extend slavery longer, and more enslaved would become better off. These are arguments. These are positions.
So there you are, chair of this Caribbean Regional Commission looking at the issue of reparations. First step you wanted was a formal apology from the former colonial colonizers like the United Kingdom and so on. You haven't got very far, have you?
Well, because there has always been two approaches to this matter. the oppressor class, the beneficiaries of these crimes against humanity, have always preferred to have a settlement approach. Look what Germany has just done in Namibia. That wasn't reparations. That was a settlement. And here's how the
That was what Germany paid in regards to the
genocide in Namibia,
genocide in the early 20th century, the Herero people.
And that has become the model for many European countries indeed. The Americans are ambivalent about it. But here's the issue. You have to say that reparations is a process. It's not an event. Settlement is an event. You can show that you have suffered harm. The harm has become systemic. Those who have benefited from that harm could actually say, here's $1 billion, take it and go away. That's closure. Reparations says no.
So what do you want then?
First of all, reparations is a process. It begins with the step that says we admit responsibility for the crimes we have committed. We accept. You
don't get that though, do you? You just get expressions of regret, like David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, in 2015 when he went to Jamaica.
Because
no apology.
The European governments prefer to say, we regret very much what we have done. And that's the end of the conversation. Reparations says, we apologize for what we have done. Now let us work together in partnership and work through the consequences of what we have done. So reparations is really a partnership relationship that may lead to development, but importantly, it leads to the elevation of those who continue to suffer the harm. We don't want necessarily to be locked into a discourse around settlements. We want to speak about the process of reparations, the development consequences, development in all the areas that
development money for countries where there were enslaved African descendants.
Barbados,
that's what you want?
Yes. This is where the British established their model. What was the model? The British came here in the 1620s. The following decade, the British said, all black people on this island and those who are coming here in the future will be classified as non-human. They're going to be classified as property, real estate, and chattel. First step. Second step, 1661. Britain used this island as a laboratory for the constitutional development of slavery, which says all African peoples are of a vile and barbarous nature and should not be governed under the same laws as Christians, thus the white supremacy. This is a laboratory. From here, it moved across the Caribbean. It moved to the United States. So having this interview here, you have come to the source of the crime that we are trying to adjudicate today in the broad context of reparations.
And I keep on asking you this, and you say, but you're not making much progress, are you?
Yes, we are making
on government-to-government level at all.
We are making significant progress. We do not expect this to happen overnight. Remember,
well, you've said you've been arguing for it for 100 years.
Absolutely.
So what has the UK government, for instance, said on reparations?
The UK government has always said that slavery was not a crime, that slavery was legal. We did nothing wrong. We're not going to apologize.
You're not shifting minds, are you?
Well, we are trying, and we will always try. But here's the issue, Zainab. It took us all of the 19th century to uproot slavery from the world. The Haitians first in 1804, through to the English, the French, the Dutch, and ultimately the Portuguese in Brazil. It took 100 years of struggle to end slavery. Then it took us another 100 years to convert freedom into civil rights. It took us all of the 20th century.
You're saying patience.
All of the 20th century to get civil rights.
Okay.
If it takes us all of the 21st century to have reparatory justice,
you think you'll get
generation by generation, the struggle goes on.
All right. But let me ask you, while you're waiting for official recognition from governments, what about the role of business? We've seen in the United Kingdom, for instance, the insurance company Lloyd's and also Brewer King apologised for their roles in the transatlantic slave trade and offered financial support to charities promoting diversity and inclusion. Glasgow University in Scotland in 2019 said it will raise nearly $30 million to have a Caribbean Centre for Development Research. I mean, that kind of piecemeal approach, is that acceptable?
But yes, but here we go again, where the beneficiaries of those crimes are admitting that they have committed the crimes, but they wish to control the narrative, the policies and the consequences. When Lloyd's of London, Barclays Bank, the Royal Bank of Scotland, the Midland Bank, when all of these major financial institutions in the insurance sector and the financial services sector, the banking sector, all admitted that their companies and corporations rose up from the foul environment of slavery. What they wish to do as a consequence is to tell us what they are going to do about it. And so they put what we call something on the table, an offensive public relation act to say, we will put £1 million in this community charity, but they're not talking to us.
All right, so
and
you
they might not wish to talk to us right now, but they will have to talk to us sooner or later. The consciousness here has been awakened by historical discourses, by the realization that this long journey, this 394-year journey with the British monarchy has done us harm. We have not had any benefits to be associated with.
What harm does the Queen do as being head of state? She's a very benign presence.
Yes, but look at what happened with
no
the
power.
Windrush. Look at what happened to the Windrush people. We fought for the British Empire in the Second World War. We kicked the butt out of Hitler and his Third Reich. We won the war. Then we were invited to Britain. My parents' generation came to Britain to clean up the mess that the British had experienced from all the bombings of the Germans. And the first opportunity, they were surrounded by deepening institutional racism that hurt those Caribbean people to the core. They appealed to the monarchy. They appealed to the government. There was silence, because that is the history. But let me tell you, there's a photograph on the cover of my recent book, Britain's Black Debt, and it shows Queen Elizabeth visiting the Bell Sugar Plantation in 1966, February, on the eve of independence. And what did the Queen do? She came to Barbados to visit a sugar plantation that was owned by her first cousin, the Earl of Harewood. And here's the Earl and the Queen on their sugar plantation in Barbados in February 1966.
So,
a plantation that was bought by the families of the Earls
in
1782 with 300 slaves.
So it's the symbolism of that kind of act.
All right. Powerful symbolism.
What about the Commonwealth, though? Because Philip Murphy, director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, says the Commonwealth has an admirable record of progressive causes, most notably the struggle against apartheid. Would you want Barbados to leave the Commonwealth too?
No, I live in a modern world. I live in a realistic environment. The Commonwealth is a very significant institution. There are challenges, of course, with most institutions. The Commonwealth is made up of the categories of the British Empire. There's the white Commonwealth, there's a brown Commonwealth, and there's a black Commonwealth, all together under the rubric, the Commonwealth. There are some serious challenges within the relationship and the elements within the Commonwealth. But on the whole, I believe on balance, at this moment in time, it is a force for progress.
You, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, are one of Barbados's most distinguished citizens, Vice-Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. Could you conceivably become the new head of state here in Barbados?
No, I don't think so. I think we have a model. And that model is that our heads of states ought to be diplomats, to be people who transcend all of the social forces and the contradictions of the society. My role in the society is to identify those contradictions, promote them, build advocacy around them, explore all the challenges we are facing to make the society a better place. We have to re-engineer the society. I see my role as an engineer, not a diplomat.
Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, thank you very much indeed for coming on Hard Talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I honestly started to believe I was going to be one of those athletes that's just going to be second or third best or fourth best, never meant for Paralympic gold.
A podcast about athletes who have stood on the Olympic and Paralympic podium.
Getting out of the hospital, I did not have any energy. I was just devastated, broken. I could not do a thing.
And the stories that got them there.
The quickest way to get me to do something is to tell me I can't do it.
On the Podium from the BBC World Service.
Olympic medal is very big deal in India.
When you arrive at the airport, the whole nation is there.
Everyone was out in the streets, and I'm talking like everybody.
Search for On the Podium wherever you get your podcasts.